The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching summer sun of 1887, its red earth cracked and thirsting for rain that hadn't come in 3 months. Dust devils danced across the desert floor like spirits of the restless dead, while somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote's cry echoed through the canyon walls. The town of Tombstone had seen better days since the silver mines began to play out, but it still clung to life with the stubborn determination of a desert cactus. In the center of town, where the main street intersected with Allen Street, a wooden platform had been hastily constructed. Chains hung from iron posts, driven deep into the desert hardpan, their metal links glinting like cruel teeth in the merciless sunlight. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and barely contained hatred. Men in worn cowboy hats stood next to women, clutching their children close, all of them drawn by the spectacle that Sheriff Morrison had promised them. "Folks, gather round," Sheriff Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge and the weight of 3 decades spent keeping order in lawless towns. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much violence, too much death, and not enough justice. "Today we got ourselves a real live Apache squaw, caught red-handed, stealing from the Henderson Ranch. Found her with their missing cattle, bold as brass." The crowd murmured with approval, their voices rising like the buzz of angry hornets. Someone shouted from the back, "String her up, Sheriff. That's what we do with cattle thieves." Others nodded in agreement, their hands unconsciously moving to the guns at their hips. Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Now hold on there, Pete. We ain't in the business of lynching women, not even Apache ones. But we are going to make an example of her, show her people what happens when they come onto our land and take what ain't theirs." The sheriff's words carried across the dusty street, past the saloons and general stores, past the church where Reverend Williams was saying his morning prayers, and all the way to the outskirts of town where a lone horseman sat watching from atop a ridge. The man's name was Thomas Mitchell, though most folks just called him Mitch, and he had been riding for 3 days straight with only short stops to rest his horse and catch a few hours of sleep under the stars. Mitch was a tall man, lean from years of hard living and harder choices. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held the kind of sadness that comes from losing everything that matters in this world. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well-maintained. The Colt 45 on his hip had seen plenty of use, but it was the kind of use that came from necessity, not from the love of violence. He had been heading to California, following rumors of work on the big cattle ranches near San Francisco, when the sound of the crowd had drawn his attention. Now he sat on his horse, watching the scene unfold below with a growing sense of unease. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Bring her out," someone shouted from the crowd, and Sheriff Morrison nodded to his deputy, a young man named Billy Carson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than standing on that platform with chains in his hands. The jail door creaked open on rusted hinges, and Deputy Carson emerged, followed by a figure that made the crowd fall silent for a moment. She was a young Apache woman, probably no more than 25 years old, with long black hair that cascaded down her back like a midnight waterfall. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, and her dark eyes held a fierce dignity that the chains around her wrists and ankles could not diminish. She walked with her head held high, her back straight as an arrow, showing no fear despite the hostile crowd that surrounded the platform. Her traditional Apache dress was torn and dirty from her time in jail, but she wore it like royal robes. When she looked out at the faces in the crowd, there was no pleading in her expression, no begging for mercy. There was only the quiet strength of a woman who had faced hardship before and survived. "There she is, folks," Sheriff Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. "This here's the Apache squaw that's been causing trouble for our ranchers. Found her with 20 head of Henderson cattle, driving them toward the reservation like she owned them." The woman's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been contempt. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, with only the slightest accent to betray her Apache heritage. "I did not steal cattle. I found them wandering. No brands. I was bringing them to town." A wave of derisive laughter swept through the crowd. "Listen to her lie," shouted a man in a dirty apron who Mitch recognized as the local blacksmith. "Apache don't know nothing about bringing stolen cattle to town. They know about eating them, though." More laughter, crueler this time. The woman's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward and began fastening the chains that would hold her to the platform. "You'll stay here for 3 days," he told her, loud enough for everyone to hear. 3 days in the sun, with just enough water to keep you alive. Maybe that'll teach you and your people to respect other folks' property. From his vantage point on the ridge, Mitch felt his stomach turn. He had seen a lot of rough justice in his 32 years, but there was something about chaining a woman to a platform in the desert sun that struck him as purely cruel. He thought about his own wife, Sarah, and how she would have reacted to seeing such a thing. Sarah had always had a soft heart for the downtrodden, whether they were injured animals or people who had fallen on hard times. Sarah. Even thinking her name brought a familiar stab of pain to his chest. It had been 2 years since the fever took her. 2 years since he had watched helplessly as the woman he loved more than life itself slipped away in their little cabin outside Denver. 2 years, and the pain was still as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He had left Denver the day after the funeral, unable to bear the memories that lurked in every corner of their home. Since then, he had been drifting from town to town, taking whatever work he could find, trying to outrun the ghosts that followed him wherever he went. But somehow, watching this Apache woman being chained like an animal brought back memories of Sarah's compassion, her belief that every person deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. Down in the town, the crowd was beginning to disperse. Most of the townspeople had seen what they came to see and were heading back to their daily routines. The saloons would be busy tonight as folks discussed the day's events over whiskey and cards. Children would be warned to stay away from the platform, though Mitch suspected that more than a few would sneak close to get a look at the chained Apache woman. Sheriff Morrison was giving final instructions to Deputy Carson, who would be responsible for keeping watch over the prisoner and providing her with the bare minimum of water needed to keep her alive. The young deputy looked uncomfortable with his assignment, but he nodded and took his position in the shade of a nearby building where he could keep an eye on the platform. As the last of the crowd drifted away, Mitch found himself alone on the ridge, still watching the scene below. The Apache woman stood as straight as she could, with the chains limiting her movement, her face turned toward the desert horizon, as if she could see something there that was invisible to everyone else. Even from a distance, Mitch could sense her dignity, her refusal to be broken by the humiliation and cruelty of her captors. He thought about riding on, about putting this ugly scene behind him and continuing his journey to California. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Getting involved in local politics was a good way to find trouble, and Mitch had enough troubles of his own without borrowing more from strangers. But something held him there on that ridge, something that felt like Sarah's gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him to do what was right rather than what was easy. The sun was climbing higher now, and Mitch could see the heat beginning to affect the chained woman. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she had to squint against the glare that reflected off the white-painted buildings around the platform. By noon, the temperature would be well over 100 degrees, and she would be standing in the direct sunlight with no shade, no relief, except for the small cup of water that Deputy Carson would grudgingly provide every few hours. Mitch had seen men die from exposure to the desert sun, had watched strong cowboys reduced to babbling, sunburned wrecks after just a day without adequate water and shelter. The thought of this woman enduring 3 days of such torture made his jaw clench with anger. Whatever she had or hadn't done, she didn't deserve to be slowly killed by the elements while the good people of Tombstone went about their business. He made his decision then, though he wasn't entirely sure what form his intervention would take. Guiding his horse down the ridge toward the town, Mitch began to formulate a plan. First, he needed to learn more about the situation, about the woman and the charges against her. Then he would decide how best to help her, assuming she even wanted his help. As he rode into Tombstone, Mitch noticed the way people looked at him. He was clearly a stranger, and in a town like this, strangers were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves otherwise. His clothes marked him as a drifter, a cowboy without a home ranch, and such men were often trouble. But Mitch had learned long ago how to project an air of quiet confidence that discouraged most folks from challenging him directly. He stopped first at the livery stable, where an old Mexican man named Carlos took charge of his horse, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been caring for animals all his life. "You staying long, senor?" Carlos asked as he led the horse into a stall. "Not sure yet," Mitch replied, handing over the appropriate coins. "Depends on what kind of opportunities might present themselves." Carlos nodded knowingly. There is always work for a man who is not afraid of hard labor. The mines are still producing some silver, and the ranchers always need good hands. But I think maybe you are not here for ordinary work, eh? The old man's eyes were sharp and knowing, and Mitch got the impression that very little happened in Tombstone without Carlos being aware of it. "What makes you say that? A man who watches a town for an hour before riding in is usually a man with something particular on his mind," Carlos replied with a slight smile. "And today, there is only one thing that would draw such attention, the Apache woman." Mitch didn't bother to deny it. "What do you know about her situation?" Carlos glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then spoke in a lower voice. "Her name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in Apache. She is from Geronimo's band, but she has been living peacefully on the reservation for 2 years now. She has a young son, maybe 4 years old, who is back at the reservation with her sister." This information hit Mitch harder than he had expected. Somehow, knowing that she had a child waiting for her made the situation even more intolerable. "What about the cattle theft charges?" Carlos shrugged. "Who can say? Henderson claims she was driving his cattle toward the reservation, but Henderson is not known for his honesty. Some say he has been grazing his cattle on Apache land and claiming it as his own range. Maybe the cattle were on Apache land to begin with. And Sheriff Morrison. Morrison is not a bad man, but he is under pressure from the townspeople and the ranchers to be tough on the Apache. There have been raids and counter-raids for months now, and people are scared. They want someone to blame, someone to punish." Mitch absorbed this information, feeling the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. What would happen if someone were to say, "Help her escape"? Carlos's weathered face grew serious. "That would be a very dangerous thing to do, senor. The town would form a posse, and they would hunt down anyone who helped an Apache escape justice. There would be nowhere to hide between here and Mexico. And if she stays chained to that platform for 3 days in this heat, she will probably die," Carlos admitted quietly. "And her son will be an orphan, raised by an aunt who already has 6 children of her own to feed." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the implications of the situation hanging heavy between them. Finally, Mitch spoke. "Where's the best place to get a drink and hear what folks are saying about all this?" "The Oriental Saloon," Carlos replied without hesitation. "That's where the ranchers and the businessmen drink. If you want to know what the powerful men in this town are thinking, that's where you'll find them." Mitch nodded his thanks and headed toward the main street. The Oriental Saloon was easy to find, its batwing doors standing open to catch whatever breeze might stir in the stifling heat. As he pushed through the doors, Mitch was hit by the familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies that characterized saloons throughout the West. The interior was dimly lit, a welcome relief from the harsh sunlight outside. A long bar ran along one wall, tended by a bartender with impressive mustache and the kind of belly that came from sampling too much of his own product. Several tables were occupied by men playing cards or simply nursing drinks while they talked in low voices about the day's events. Mitch approached the bar and ordered a whiskey, paying for it with coins that clinked softly on the scarred wooden surface. The bartender, whose name tag identified him as Frank, poured the drink with practiced precision. and then lingered nearby, clearly hoping for conversation. "You're new in town," Frank observed, making it sound like a question even though it wasn't. "Just passing through," Mitch replied, taking a sip of the whiskey and feeling it burn pleasantly down his throat. "Heard there was some excitement today." Frank's face lit up with the expression of a man who loved to gossip. "Oh, you bet there was. We got ourselves a genuine Apache cattle thief chained up right in the middle of town. Sheriff Morrison's making an example of her, showing these Indians that we ain't gonna tolerate their stealing and raiding." "Cattle thief, huh?" Mitch kept his voice neutral, encouraging Frank to continue talking. 20 head of prime beef, stolen right off the Henderson ranch. Bold as brass she was, driving them toward the reservation like she owned them. Of course, that's how these Apache are. They think everything belongs to them, just because their ancestors used to roam all over this territory. From a table near the back of the saloon, a gravelly voice spoke up. "Damn right, Frank. About time someone taught these savages a lesson they won't forget." Mitch turned to see who had spoken and found himself looking at a heavy-set man in expensive clothes who was clearly used to being the most important person in any room he entered. The man's face was red from too much sun and too much drink, and his small eyes held the kind of mean intelligence that Mitch had learned to recognize and distrust. "That would be Mr. Henderson," Frank whispered to Mitch, his voice carrying a note of respect mixed with fear. "Owns one of the biggest ranches in the territory, his cattle that got stolen." Henderson had noticed Mitch's attention and was now studying him with obvious suspicion. "Don't believe I know you, stranger. You got business in Tombstone, or are you just another drifter looking for trouble?" The question was asked in a tone that suggested Henderson was used to getting straight answers from people who crossed his path. Mitch met his gaze steadily, drawing on years of experience dealing with bullies and would-be tough guys. "Name's Mitchell," he said simply. "I'm heading to California, just stopped to rest my horse and maybe find some work to replenish my traveling money." "Biz Mitchell, huh?" Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of work you looking for, Mitchell?" "Anything honest that pays a fair wage. I've worked cattle, done some mining, can handle a gun if the situation calls for it." This last comment seemed to get Henderson's attention. He gestured for Mitch to join him at his table, and after a moment's hesitation, Mitch complied. Up close, Henderson looked even more like the kind of man who was used to getting his way through intimidation and wealth. "You know anything about Apache, Mitchell?" Henderson asked once Mitch had settled into the chair across from him. "I know they're people, same as anyone else. Some good, some bad. Most just trying to get by." Henderson's face darkened at this response. "Well, you're wrong about that. Apache ain't people. Not the way you and I are people. They're savages, pure and simple. Give them an inch and they'll take a mile, steal everything you own, and probably burn your house down for good measure." Mitch said nothing, but his silence seemed to encourage Henderson to continue his rant. "Take that squaw we got chained up out there. Pretty as a picture, I'll give her that, but she's got the soul of a thief just like all her kind. Found her with my cattle, driving them toward the reservation bold as brass. If I hadn't been out checking my boundaries, she would have gotten clean away with 20 head of prime beef." "How do you know they were your cattle?" Mitch asked carefully. Henderson's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "What do you mean, how do I know? They were on my land, weren't they? And she was driving them away from my ranch, not toward it. What more proof do you need? Were they branded?" "Course they were branded. Every rancher worth his salt brands his cattle. Had my H-bar-H mark clear as day." But something in Henderson's eyes suggested that this wasn't entirely true, and Mitch filed that information away for future reference. He was beginning to get a clearer picture of what had really happened, and it wasn't matching up with the story that Sheriff Morrison had told the crowd. "Must have been quite a sight," Mitch said. "One woman driving 20 head of cattle all by herself." Henderson paused in the act of lifting his glass to his lips. "Well, she had help, naturally. These Apache, they work in groups. Probably had a whole war party helping her, but they scattered when they saw me coming." More lies, Mitch thought, but he kept his expression neutral. "Lucky thing you showed up when you did." Damn right it was lucky, and now she's paying the price for her thievery. 3 days chained up in the sun ought to teach her and her people a lesson they won't soon forget. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another man, this one tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a deputy's badge on his vest, and his young features were marked by worry lines that seemed too deep for his age. "Mr. Henderson," the young man said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "Sheriff Morrison sent me to let you know that everything's secure. The prisoner is chained up tight, and I'll be keeping watch to make sure nothing happens to her." Henderson nodded with satisfaction. "Good work, Carson. Make sure she gets just enough water to keep her alive, but not enough to keep her comfortable. I want her to suffer for what she did." Deputy Carson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Sheriff Morrison's orders were pretty clear on that point. As Carson turned to leave, Mitch caught his eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, he saw something that gave him hope, doubt. The young deputy didn't like what he was being asked to do, even if he felt obligated to follow orders. After Carson left, Henderson turned back to Mitch with renewed interest. "You know, Mitchell, I might have some work for you after all. I can always use another gun, especially one that's not squeamish about dealing with Indian trouble." What kind of dealing are we talking about?" Mitch asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that keeps my cattle safe and my ranch prosperous. The Apache have been getting bold lately, raiding settlements and stealing livestock. Sometimes a man has to take matters into his own hands to protect what's his." Mitch nodded non-committally. "I'll think about it. Right now I'm more interested in getting some food and a room for the night. It's been a long day on the trail." Henderson seemed satisfied with this response. "Fair enough. You get yourself settled, and we'll talk more tomorrow. I think you and I could do business together, Mitchell." As Mitch left the saloon, he felt the weight of Henderson's expectation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The man clearly expected him to become part of whatever campaign of intimidation and violence he was waging against the local Apache population. But Mitch had no intention of becoming anyone's hired gun, especially not in a cause that seemed built on lies and hatred. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, but the heat was still oppressive as Mitch walked through the town's dusty streets. He could see the platform where Ayanna was chained, and even from a distance he could tell that the day's heat was taking its toll on her. Her head was bowed now, and she was swaying slightly on her feet. Deputy Carson sat in the shade of a nearby building, periodically glancing at his prisoner with what looked like genuine concern. A tin cup sat on the ground beside him, presumably the vessel he would use to provide Ayanna with her meager water ration. Mitch continued his walk through the town, taking note of the layout of the streets, the locations of the various businesses, and the general mood of the people he encountered. Most folks seemed to view the public punishment of the Apache woman with approval, though he noticed a few who seemed uncomfortable with the spectacle. At the general store, he overheard a conversation between two women that gave him additional insight into the local situation. "I still say it's not right, chaining a woman up like that," one of them was saying in a low voice. "I don't care what she might have done." "Hush, Mary," the other woman replied, glancing around nervously. "You know what happened to the Jameson family when they spoke up for the Indians. Their store got boycotted, and they had to leave town." I know, but that doesn't make it right. She's got a child, you know. Little boy, maybe 4 years old. What's going to happen to him if she dies out there?" This confirmation of what Carlos had told him made Mitch's jaw clench with anger. The image of a 4-year-old Apache boy waiting for his mother to return, not knowing that she was slowly dying of exposure in the middle of Tombstone, was almost more than he could bear. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mitch found himself drawn repeatedly back to the area around the platform. Each time he passed by, Ayanna looked a little worse. Her face was flushed with heat, and despite her obvious efforts to maintain her dignity, she was clearly suffering. Deputy Carson had given her water twice that Mitch had observed, but the portions were small and grudging. The young deputy seemed to be following his orders to the letter, providing just enough liquid to keep the prisoner alive, but not enough to provide any real relief from the heat. As darkness finally began to fall over Tombstone, Mitch made his way to the boarding house where he had taken a room for the night. The proprietor, a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Patterson, was a talkative woman who seemed eager to share her opinions about the day's events. "Terrible business, this whole Apache situation," she said as she showed Mitch to his room. "Not that I'm saying she didn't deserve punishment if she really stole those cattle, but chaining a woman up in the sun like that, it just doesn't sit right with me." "You don't think she's guilty?" Mitch asked carefully. Mrs. Patterson glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then spoke in a lower voice. "Between you and me, I'm not sure Henderson's version of events is entirely truthful. That man's been having boundary disputes with the Apache for months now, claiming they've been grazing their horses on his land when most folks know he's been pushing his cattle onto reservation territory. What do you think really happened? I think maybe those cattle wandered off Henderson's ranch and onto Apache land, and when that poor woman found them, she was trying to do the right thing by bringing them to town. But Henderson saw a chance to make an example of her, and Sheriff Morrison went along with it to keep the peace." This version of events matched what Mitch had been piecing together from his conversations throughout the day. It seemed increasingly likely that Ayanna was innocent of cattle theft and was being punished simply for being Apache at a time when tensions between the two communities were running high. As he settled into his small but clean room, Mitch found himself thinking about Sarah and what she would have expected him to do in this situation. His wife had always believed that a person's worth wasn't determined by the color of their skin or the culture they came from, but by their actions and their character. She would have been appalled by the treatment Ayanna was receiving, and she would have expected Mitch to do something about it. But what could he do? He was one man in a hostile town with no legal authority and no allies except possibly a young deputy who seemed troubled by his orders. Any attempt to free Ayanna would likely result in his own death and would probably make things worse for her in the long run. Still, as he lay on the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night, Mitch couldn't shake the image of that Apache woman standing straight and proud despite the chains that bound her. There was something about her dignity in the face of cruelty that reminded him of all the best qualities he had seen in humanity, qualities that seemed to be in short supply in Tombstone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The question was whether Mitch would find the courage to act on his convictions or whether he would take the safe path and continue his journey to California, leaving Ayanna to her fate. Outside his window, the desert night was alive with the sounds of coyotes and night birds, a wild symphony that spoke of freedom and untamed spaces. Somewhere in that darkness, a 4-year-old Apache boy was probably crying himself to sleep, wondering why his mother hadn't come home. And on a platform in the center of town, a woman named Ayanna stood chained under the stars, enduring her punishment with a strength that would have impressed even her harshest critics if they had possessed the wisdom to recognize it. Chapter 2. The Weight of Conscience. The first light of dawn crept across the Arizona desert like a cautious animal, painting the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Thomas Mitchell had barely slept, his mind churning with memories of Sarah and images of the chained Apache woman who stood suffering in the town square just a few hundred yards from his boarding house window. He had risen before sunrise and dressed quietly in the gray pre-dawn light, his movements automatic after years of early mornings on cattle drives and lonely trails. His reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin showed a man who looked older than his 32 years, with lines of grief etched around his blue eyes and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily. Downstairs, Mrs. Patterson was already bustling around her kitchen, preparing breakfast for her handful of boarders. The widow was a kind woman who reminded Mitch painfully of his own mother, dead these 10 years from consumption. She looked up as he entered the dining room, her face creased with concern. "You're up mighty early, Mr. Mitchell," she said, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Couldn't sleep." "Not much," Mitch admitted, accepting the cup of strong coffee she offered him. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. "It's that Apache woman, isn't it? I saw you watching from your window last night. Breaks your heart to see another human being treated that way, doesn't it?" Mitch took a sip of the bitter coffee, using the moment to consider his words carefully. "I've seen a lot of rough justice in my time, ma'am. But there's something about this situation that doesn't sit right with me." "You're not the only one who feels that way," Mrs. Patterson said, glancing toward the kitchen door to make sure no one else was listening. "Doc Holliday stopped by yesterday evening to check on her condition. He didn't say much, but I could see the disapproval in his face. Even a man like Doc, who's killed his share of men in gunfights, thinks this punishment is too harsh." This information surprised Mitch. Doc Holliday was a legend throughout the West, known as much for his deadly skill with a gun as for his education and his tuberculosis. If even Holliday thought the treatment of Ayanna was excessive, then perhaps Mitch wasn't alone in his feelings about the situation. "What did the doctor say about her condition?" Mitch asked. "Just that she was holding up better than most men would under the circumstances, but that another 2 days in this heat would likely kill her. He wanted to move her to the jail where she'd have some shade, but Sheriff Morrison refused. Said the whole point was to make an example of her where everyone could see." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a note of disgust that told Mitch exactly what she thought of Sheriff Morrison's reasoning. The widow might be a simple boarding house keeper, but she clearly had strong opinions about right and wrong. After finishing his coffee and declining the offer of breakfast, Mitch stepped out into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains, and the temperature was still bearable, though he knew that within a few hours the heat would become punishing once again. The town was quiet at this early hour, with only the occasional early riser moving about their business. As Mitch walked toward the town square, he could see Deputy Carson sitting in his usual spot in the shade of the hardware store, a tin cup of water in his hands. The young man looked like he hadn't slept any better than Mitch had. Ayanna was still standing upright, though Mitch could see that the effort was costing her dearly. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and her lips were cracked from thirst despite the small amounts of water she had been given. But her eyes were still alert, still defiant, and when she noticed him approaching, she straightened her shoulders with visible effort. "Morning, Deputy," Mitch said as he approached Carson's position. The young man looked up, and Mitch could see the strain and doubt written clearly across his features. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell. You're up early. Couldn't sleep. Thought I might take a walk before the heat gets too bad." Mitch gestured toward Ayanna. "How's she holding up?" Carson glanced at his prisoner, then back at Mitch. "Better than I expected, to be honest. Most men would have collapsed by now, but she's still standing. Still hasn't asked for mercy or begged to be released." There was a note of admiration in the deputy's voice that he probably didn't realize was there. Mitch filed that information away as potentially useful. "Must be hard, watching someone suffer like that," Mitch observed carefully. Carson was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cup of water in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't sign up to be a torturer, Mr. Mitchell. I became a deputy to keep the peace and uphold the law, not to slowly kill women in the public square. Then why don't you do something about it?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Carson looked up sharply, his young face flushing with a mixture of anger and shame. "Because I have orders," he said finally. "Because Sheriff Morrison is a good man who's trying to keep this town from erupting into violence. Because if I disobey him, I'll lose my job and probably get run out of town on a rail. And because you're afraid," Mitch added quietly. Carson's jaw tightened. "Aren't you? You've been watching this situation for almost 24 hours now, and you haven't done anything about it either. At least I have an excuse. I'm bound by my oath as a deputy. What's yours?" The question hit Mitch harder than he had expected, because it forced him to confront the truth about his own inaction. He was afraid, Afraid of getting involved, afraid of the consequences, afraid of caring about someone again and potentially losing them the way he had lost Sarah. "You're right," he admitted. "I am afraid. But fear isn't a good enough reason to stand by and watch an innocent woman die." "How do you know she's innocent?" Carson asked, though his tone suggested he wanted to believe it was true. "Because I've talked to enough people in this town to piece together what really happened. Henderson's been grazing his cattle on Apache land for months, and when some of them wandered off and Ayanna found them, she was trying to do the right thing by bringing them to town. Henderson saw a chance to make an example of her, and everyone went along with it because they're scared of more Indian troubles." Carson was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. Finally, he spoke again. "Even if that's true, what can we do about it now? She's been convicted and sentenced. If we help her escape, we'll both be wanted men." "Maybe," Mitch agreed. "Or maybe there's another way. What if we could prove she was innocent? What if we could show the town that Henderson lied about the circumstances of her arrest? How would we do that?" Mitch had been thinking about this question for most of the night, and he thought he might have an answer. Henderson claimed the cattle were branded with his mark, but I'm betting they weren't. If we could prove that those cattle were unbranded strays, or even better, if we could show they were actually Apache cattle that had wandered onto Henderson's land, we might be able to get her conviction overturned. Carson looked skeptical. "And where are these cattle now?" "That's what we need to find out. Henderson probably had them driven back to his ranch, but there might be witnesses who saw them before they were moved. Someone who could testify about their condition and their brands." The deputy was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he looked directly at Mitch. "Why are you doing this? You don't know this woman, and helping her could get you killed. What's in it for you?" It was a fair question, and one that Mitch had been asking himself since he first saw Ayanna chained to the platform. "I had a wife," he said finally. "She died of fever 2 years ago. Sarah always believed that people should be judged by their actions, not by the color of their skin or where they were born. She would have been disgusted by what's happening here, and she would have expected me to do something about it." Carson nodded slowly, as if this explanation made sense to him. "My sister died of consumption last year," he said quietly. "She was only 19, and she never hurt anyone in her whole life. Sometimes I think about how I would feel if someone had chained her up in the sun to die, and I know I'd want someone to stand up for her." "Then you'll help me?" "I'll listen to your plan," Carson said carefully, "but I won't promise anything beyond that." It was more than Mitch had hoped for, and he felt a flicker of optimism for the first time since arriving in Tombstone. "First, we need to find out more about those cattle. Do you know anyone who might have seen them before Henderson moved them?" Carson thought for a moment. "There's an old Mexican vaquero named Pablo who works for the Sanchez family. They have a small ranch about 5 miles south of Henderson's spread. Pablo rides the boundary between the two properties pretty regularly, checking on water sources and looking for strays. If anyone would have seen those cattle, it would be him. Can you get word to him? Ask him to meet us somewhere private where we can talk." "Maybe. Pablo's not fond of Henderson. There's been bad blood between the Sanchez family and Henderson over water rights for years. He might be willing to talk if he thinks it could cause Henderson some trouble." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sheriff Morrison was walking toward them, his face already showing the signs of strain that came with managing a volatile situation. He nodded to Mitch and then addressed his deputy. "How's she doing, Billy?" "Still standing, Sheriff. I gave her water about an hour ago." Morrison walked closer to the platform and studied Ayanna with the dispassionate gaze of a man evaluating livestock. The Apache woman met his stare without flinching, her dark eyes showing no trace of the fear or desperation that most people would feel in her situation. "Tough as rawhide, this one," Morrison muttered. "Most folks would have broken by now, begging for mercy, or at least asking for more water, but she just stands there like she's made of stone. Maybe because she knows she's innocent," Mitch suggested quietly. Morrison turned to look at him sharply. "You got something to say about this situation, stranger?" Mitch met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Just an observation. In my experience, guilty people tend to break down and confess when they're under pressure. Innocent people tend to endure whatever punishment they're given because they know they don't deserve it. And in my experience," Morrison replied coldly, "Apache don't think the same way white folks do. They don't have the same sense of guilt or shame that civilized people have. This one could be guilty as sin and still stand there looking defiant." The casual racism in Morrison's words made Mitch's jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting into an argument with the sheriff wouldn't help Ayanna, and it would certainly make any future investigation more difficult. "Maybe you're right," Mitch said diplomatically. "I'm just a stranger passing through. I don't know the local situation like you do." Morrison seemed satisfied with this response. "Exactly. You don't know these Apache like we do. They've been raiding and stealing in this territory for generations. It's only recently that we've been able to establish any kind of law and order, and we can't afford to show weakness now." As the sheriff walked away, Mitch caught Carson's eye. The young deputy's expression suggested that he was beginning to see the situation in a new light, recognizing the prejudice and assumptions that were driving the town's treatment of Ayanna. The morning progressed slowly, with the heat building steadily as the sun climbed higher in the sky. More townspeople began to emerge from their homes and businesses, going about their daily routines, while occasionally glancing at the chained woman in the town square. Some looked at her with satisfaction, others with curiosity, and a few with what might have been sympathy. Around mid-morning, a small commotion near the general store caught Mitch's attention. A group of Apache men on horseback had arrived in town, and they were clearly agitated about something. The leader was an older man with gray, streaking his long black hair, and deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. Sheriff Morrison hurried over to confront the group, his hand resting casually on his gun butt in a gesture that was meant to be both reassuring to the townspeople and threatening to the Apache visitors. "What do you want here?" Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. The older Apache man replied in heavily accented English, "I am Joseph, brother to Ayanna's father. We come to speak for her, to pay for cattle if she took them." "She's already been tried and convicted," Morrison replied firmly. "The time for paying fines or making restitution is past. She'll serve her sentence according to the law." "Your law," Joseph said, his voice heavy with bitterness. "Apache law says when someone accused of crime, family can speak for them, can offer payment to make things right." "Well, you're not on Apache land anymore," Morrison said. "You're in Tombstone, and here we follow American law." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men faced each other. The Apache riders were clearly outnumbered and outgunned, but they showed no signs of backing down. Townspeople began to gather at a safe distance, watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and excitement. Mitch found himself moving closer, drawn by the possibility that these Apache men might have information that could help prove Ayanna's innocence. As he approached, he heard Joseph speaking again. "We know Henderson lies about cattle. His cows eat Apache grass for many moons, drink from Apache springs. When we find them on our land, we try to return them to town. Be good neighbors." "That's not what Henderson says," Morrison replied. "He says your people have been stealing his cattle and driving them back to the reservation." "Henderson says many lies," Joseph said with quiet dignity. "He tells you cattle have his mark, but we know cattle have no mark. We know because we see them many times on our land, always no mark." This was exactly the information Mitch had been hoping to find. If Joseph was telling the truth, then Henderson had lied about the cattle being branded, which would cast serious doubt on his entire version of events. But before Mitch could figure out how to approach Joseph without arousing suspicion, Henderson himself arrived on the scene. The rancher was accompanied by half a dozen of his men, all of them armed and looking ready for trouble. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Henderson demanded, his face red with anger. "Why are you letting these savages come into town and make demands?" "They're not making demands," Morrison said carefully. They came to ask about the woman, and I've explained that she's serving her sentence according to law." Henderson turned his attention to Joseph, his small eyes filled with hatred. "You got some nerve coming here, old man. That squaw of yours stole 20 head of my best cattle, and now she's paying the price for it." Joseph met Henderson's gaze without flinching. "Your cattle not branded. How you prove they're yours if no brand?" "Don't you dare question me, you old buzzard," Henderson snarled. "Those cattle were on my land, and that's proof enough of ownership. Besides, they had my brand clear as day." "Show me brand book," Joseph said quietly. "Show me paper that proves cattle yours." Henderson's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and Mitch could see that the Apache man had hit a nerve. In cattle country, brands were registered with local authorities, and any legitimate rancher would have documentation to prove ownership of his stock. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Henderson blustered. "Sheriff Morrison saw the brands himself when we brought the cattle in. Didn't you, Sheriff?" Morrison looked uncomfortable, and Mitch noticed that the lawman didn't immediately confirm Henderson's claim. "Well, it was getting dark when you brought them in, and we were more concerned with securing the prisoner than examining the cattle." "But you saw the brands," Henderson insisted, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "I saw some markings on some of the animals," Morrison said carefully, "but I can't say I examined them closely enough to swear to what they were." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several of the townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation began murmuring among themselves, and Mitch could see doubt beginning to creep into some of their expressions. Henderson realized he was losing control of the situation and decided to change tactics. "It doesn't matter what you old fool thinks," he said to Joseph. "That squaw was caught red-handed driving my cattle toward the reservation. The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence speaks lies when man who finds evidence is liar," Joseph replied with quiet dignity. The insult was too much for Henderson to bear. His face contorted with rage, and his hand dropped to his gun. "Why, you... That's enough!" Sheriff Morrison stepped between the two men, his own weapon half drawn. "Henderson, keep your gun holstered. And you, Apache, you've said your piece. Now mount up and ride out of town before this situation gets out of hand." Joseph looked at Morrison for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to where Ayanna stood, chained in the merciless sun. The pain and helplessness in the old man's eyes was heartbreaking to see. "We go now," he said finally. "But Apache people not forget this day. We not forget how white man's justice works." As the Apache riders turned to leave, Joseph caught sight of Mitch, standing at the edge of the crowd. For just a moment their eyes met, and Mitch saw something in the old man's expression that might have been hope, or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. Then the Apache were gone, riding out of town in a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the still air. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension remained, hanging over the town square like smoke from a grass fire. Henderson was still furious, his face red and his hands shaking with barely controlled rage. "Did you hear that insolent savage questioning my word?" he demanded of Morrison. "In my day, we would have strung him up for talking to a white man that way." "Your day is past, Henderson," Morrison replied wearily. "These days, we try to avoid starting Indian wars if we can help it." "Indian wars," Henderson spat. "Maybe that's what this territory needs, a good old-fashioned Indian war to settle things once and for all." Morrison looked at the rancher with obvious distaste. "Is that really what you want? You remember what happened at Wounded Knee? You want that kind of bloodshed here?" Henderson didn't answer directly, but the expression on his face suggested that he wouldn't be entirely opposed to such an outcome. As he stalked away with his men trailing behind him, Mitch found himself wondering just how far the rancher might be willing to go to maintain his version of events. Deputy Carson approached Mitch as the crowd finished dispersing. The young man looked shaken by what he had witnessed. "Did you hear what that Apache man said about the cattle not being branded?" "I heard," Mitch replied, "and I noticed that Sheriff Morrison couldn't confirm Henderson's claim about seeing the brands clearly. This changes things, doesn't it? If those cattle really weren't branded, then Henderson's entire story falls apart." "It raises questions," Mitch agreed. But we need more than the word of an Apache man to convince this town that one of their prominent ranchers is a liar. Carson was quiet for a moment, watching Ayanna standing in the increasingly brutal heat. The sun was approaching its zenith now, and the temperature was becoming dangerous for anyone exposed to it for extended periods. "She's going to die out there if we don't do something soon," Carson said quietly. "Look at her. She's swaying on her feet, and her lips are starting to crack from thirst." Mitch had been thinking the same thing. Ayanna's condition was clearly deteriorating, and it was becoming increasingly urgent to find a way to either prove her innocence or get her to safety before the exposure killed her. "What about that vaquero you mentioned? Pablo? Can you get word to him today?" Carson nodded. "I can send my younger brother out to the Sanchez ranch. He's fast on horseback and he knows Pablo. If anyone can convince the old vaquero to talk, it's Tommy." "Do it," Mitch said, "and tell your brother to stress that this is a matter of life and death. If Pablo has information that could help prove those cattle weren't Henderson's property, we need to hear it as soon as possible." As Carson hurried away to make arrangements, Mitch found himself alone with his thoughts and his growing sense of urgency. The morning's confrontation had provided valuable information, but it had also made clear just how dangerous the situation was becoming. Henderson was clearly willing to go to great lengths to maintain his version of events, and he had enough influence in the town to make life very difficult for anyone who opposed him. But Mitch also sensed that there were cracks in the facade, doubts beginning to surface among some of the townspeople about the justice of Ayanna's punishment. If he could find enough evidence to prove Henderson's deception, he might be able to turn public opinion and force Sheriff Morrison to reconsider the case. The question was whether he could find that evidence before the desert sun claimed another victim. As he looked at Ayanna, standing chained and suffering in the blazing heat, Mitch made a silent promise to the memory of his beloved Sarah that he would not let this woman die if there was anything in his power to prevent it. The battle for truth and justice was just beginning, and the stakes could not be higher.